Chapter 1. The Silence of Elmsworth Green. Elmsworth was not the sort of village where dreadful things happened. It sat quietly among rolling fields of buttercup yellow, its cottages stitched together by ivy and memory. The church bells still rang each Sunday, the postman still lingered for tea at the vicarage, and the most serious scandal in living memory had been when Mrs. Blanchard's cat was found asleep in the bakery window beside the custard tarts. So when the body was found beneath the old hollow oak at the edge of the common, the world of Elmsworth tilted ever so slightly off its axis. It was a mild April morning, the air heavy with the scent of wet grass and wood smoke. Tom Priddy, the groundskeeper for Lord Havilier's estate, had gone out early with his wheelbarrow and pruning shears. He had been whistling, something cheerful from the wireless, when his dog began to bark near the old tree. Tom followed, muttering about rabbits, and there he saw it. A man, quite dead, half hidden among the roots. The look on his face, startled, confused, as though death had taken him by surprise. By 8 o'clock, the news had reached every cottage and corner shop in Elmsworth. The villagers gathered in the square, faces pale, eyes wide, speaking in the hushed, hungry tones of people who both feared and delighted in tragedy. "Found near the hollow tree, they say," murmured Mrs. Price, the butcher's wife. "A stranger, maybe. Though I heard it might be someone from Havily Hall." "Impossible," sniffed old Mr. Timmins. "Lord Havily doesn't mix with common folk. And murder, in Elmsworth? Nonsense." Miss Marple, sitting by the window of her niece's small stone cottage, listened quietly. She was not a permanent resident, merely visiting for a fortnight to help young Elspeth recover from a bout of influenza. But she had already learned much about the village, as one does when knitting in silence and being thought invisible. Through years of experience, Miss Marple had come to understand that no village, no matter how peaceful, is without its shadows. Beneath the talk of gardens and jumble sales, people carry grievances, envy, and fears, and sometimes those grow into something far darker. When Inspector Garrow arrived from the nearby town of Midsbury, his manner was brisk, his moustache as sharp as his questions. He declared the matter a straightforward case of foul play, and before the hour was out, he'd already fixed upon a suspect, young Robert Fielding, the gamekeeper's son, who had been seen near the woods the previous evening. "Too quick," Miss Marple murmured softly, as she poured tea for her niece. "What's that, Aunt Jane?" asked Elspeth, pale and curious. "Oh, nothing, dear. Only that sometimes the most obvious answer is the one least worth trusting." Outside, the church bell tolled the hour. A wind passed through the village, stirring the leaves of the great hollow tree where man had met his end, and if one had been close enough to listen, one might almost have heard the faint whisper of the woods, as though they too were holding a secret. Chapter 2. The gossip spreads across the green. By the following morning, Elmsworth was no longer the same village. The sky seemed duller, the air heavier. Even the birds sang less boldly, as though they too sensed something had gone terribly wrong beneath the boughs of the hollow tree. At the bakery, Mrs. Weller leaned over the counter to whisper to Mrs. Price, who was buying 2 loaves and a cherry bun. "They say the poor man's name was Frederick Langdon," she confided, lowering her voice to a theatrical hush. "A London gentleman staying at the inn. Imagine, murdered right under our noses." Mrs. Price's eyes widened with relish. "A Londoner, you say? No wonder. You can't trust outsiders. My husband always says trouble comes in with the trains." Within hours, every villager had a theory. Some swore Langdon was a blackmailer. Others insisted he'd been courting a married woman. Someone claimed to have seen him quarrelling near the post office. And always, like a shadow drifting behind the chatter, came the mention of young Robert Fielding. "He's a good lad," said Mr. Finch, the grocer, shaking his head. "But there's temper in him. His father's got the same streak, quick to fight, quick to regret it." By noon, half the village believed Robert guilty. By tea time, the other half wasn't so sure. Miss Marple watched it all from her seat near the cottage window, her knitting needles clinking softly in rhythm with her thoughts. Elspeth's cottage was perfectly placed for observation, overlooking both the village green and the path to the woods. And Miss Marple, though she appeared absorbed in her wool, missed nothing. She saw Mrs. Fielding rush across the square, her face pale, her hands trembling. She saw young Robert stalk toward the smithy, jaw tight, his eyes hard. She noticed, too, how Mr. Partridge, the landlord of the Fox and Hound Inn, avoided everyone's gaze, and how the vicar, usually calm and smiling, seemed deeply troubled when he passed by the church gate. It was in moments like these that Miss Marple felt the subtle stirrings of pattern, not yet a picture, but the faint outline of something taking shape. That evening, over supper, she listened to Elspeth chatter nervously about the murder. "They say the inspector's certain, Aunt Jane. Robert Fielding's coat was found near the tree, with blood on it." Miss Marple poured her tea carefully. "Was it his blood, dear?" "Well, I suppose so," Elspeth said uncertainly. "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, setting down her cup. "Supposing is such a dangerous habit, especially when one is frightened. Fear makes people see what they expect to see, not what is truly there." Later that night, as the village settled under a blanket of uneasy silence, Miss Marple stood by the window once more. The hollow tree stood far off in the distance, its black silhouette etched against a silver moon. Somewhere out there, she thought, was the truth, quiet, buried, and waiting to be uncovered. And she, as always, would listen. Chapter 3: The First Clues Beneath the Surface. The next morning dawned bright and deceptively cheerful, as if the sunlight had decided to deny all knowledge of the previous day's darkness. But for the people of Elmsworth, the brightness only made the shadows longer. At the village inn, the Fox and Hound, Inspector Garrow sat at a table surrounded by papers and cigarette smoke. The locals kept peeking through the window, eager for any scrap of new gossip. They got plenty, though most of it was wrong. By mid-morning, word had spread that the police were certain. The murdered man, Frederick Langdon, had been struck on the back of the head with a blunt object, possibly a walking stick. His pockets were untouched, his watch still ticking. Not robbery, then. Something more personal. Miss Marple, of course, heard all this while pretending to examine knitting patterns at the general store. Mrs. Weller, the shopkeeper, could never resist a good audience, especially one that listened with polite fascination and gentle encouragement. "Terrible business," Mrs. Weller sighed, handing Miss Marple her change. "Inspector says they found a letter in the poor man's coat. From a woman. Yours always, E. It said, nothing more. And you know who has an E in her name, don't you?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Why, half the women in England, my dear." She walked out into the sunshine, her thoughts quietly knitting themselves together like the wool in her basket. That afternoon, she paid a visit to Mrs. Fielding, purely, as she told Elspeth later, to offer comfort. The poor woman was distraught, her eyes swollen from weeping. Robert had been taken in for questioning. "I swear, Miss Marple," she said, gripping her teacup as if it might save her from sinking, "my boy couldn't hurt a soul. He's a bit wild, yes, but gentle at heart. He was near the woods that night, I admit it, but only to set traps for rabbits, not to do such a thing." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "And his coat?" Mrs. Fielding hesitated. "He said it was stolen from the shed 2 days before. But who'd believe that now?" Indeed, thought Miss Marple. Who would? A conveniently stolen coat was exactly the sort of tale no sensible inspector would credit. And yet, sometimes the unbelievable was the most truthful thing of all. Later, Miss Marple took a walk toward the common, her sensible shoes crunching softly on the gravel path. The hollow tree loomed ahead, old, vast, and full of whispering echoes. The police had cordoned it off, but she stopped nearby, gazing thoughtfully at the ground. She noticed something others might not have, a faint line of bicycle tracks leading from the path toward the fields. And there, half hidden in the grass, a torn scrap of paper. She bent down delicately and picked it up. Only part of a sentence remained, written in neat, slanting hand. "Promise I'll be there by 9. Don't let anyone follow." Miss Marple folded it carefully and tucked it into her glove. As she turned to leave, she saw the vicar approaching from the lane, his expression uneasy. He stopped when he saw her. "Miss Marple," he said, forcing a smile. "I didn't expect to see you here. A dreadful thing, truly dreadful." "Yes," she said softly. "And dreadful things always reveal more than one expects, if one looks closely enough." The vicar's eyes flickered, just for a moment, something like fear, before he bid her good day and hurried on his way. Miss Marple watched him go, her gaze thoughtful. The patterns were beginning to form. The trouble with patterns, of course, was that once you saw them, you could never quite unsee them again. Chapter 4: The Wrong Suspect. By Thursday morning, the village of Elmsworth had all but convicted Robert Fielding. He hadn't been seen since his arrest the previous afternoon, and that alone, to the good people of Elmsworth, was proof enough of guilt. At the post office, Mrs. Price declared that she'd always known the boy would come to a bad end. At the butcher's, young Tommy Finch said he'd once seen Robert shouting at the murdered man near the hollow tree, though he couldn't quite remember when. And at the church gate, 2 elderly women solemnly agreed that Robert's mother had looked odd lately, which could only mean something dreadful. Fear, Miss Marple reflected, was like ink in water, spreading, darkening everything it touched. Inspector Garrow, meanwhile, was rather proud of himself. He had gathered all the necessary pieces: motive, means, and opportunity. Langdon, it turned out, had been staying at the Fox and Hound for 3 nights and had argued with Robert over poaching rights on Lord Havilier's land. Robert's coat, discovered nearby with blood on the sleeve, seemed damning. The lad's temper is well known, Garrow told Miss Marple that afternoon when she encountered him outside the inn. And he's admitted he was in the woods that night. What more could one need? Perhaps a reason, Miss Marple replied gently. The inspector frowned. Reason enough for me, Miss Marple. He struck the man, panicked, and fled. Simple. Simple things, said Miss Marple mildly, are sometimes made simple only by ignoring the complicated bits. Garrow gave her a look somewhere between irritation and amusement. I admire your confidence, madam. But this isn't one of your knitting puzzles. No, she said, smiling faintly, though both require attention to dropped stitches. Later that day, Miss Marple visited the Fox and Hound in under the innocent pretense of asking for postcards. Mr. Partridge, the landlord, seemed nervous, overly eager to please, his smile too quick. Dreadful business, Miss Marple, dreadful, he said, rubbing the counter with unnecessary vigor. The poor gentleman was quiet enough. Kept to himself mostly. Wrote letters in the evening, had his supper alone. Never caused trouble. And yet, Miss Marple said softly, you seem rather troubled, Mr. Partridge. He blinked. Me, madam? Good heavens, no. Just the strain of it all. Miss Marple nodded politely and made her way out, though not before noticing the faint scent of cigar smoke lingering in the hallway, the kind used by city men, not country folk. She also saw, hanging behind the bar, a walking stick engraved with silver initials, F.L. Curious, she thought. The very sort of blunt instrument that might have caused the poor man's death, and yet Inspector Garrow hadn't mentioned recovering any such item. That evening, as she and Elspeth sat by the fire, Miss Marple spoke her thoughts aloud, though half to herself. If Robert Fielding had done this dreadful thing, he would have hidden, not returned home. Yet he did, calm enough to drink his supper tea. And if his coat were stolen, then someone must have wanted it found. There's intention in that, not panic. Elspeth looked up anxiously. You don't think Robert did it? Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear, I think Robert has been chosen, much as one chooses a scapegoat for the village fate's mischief. And whoever chose him understands human nature rather too well. Outside, the church bell tolled 9 times. Somewhere across the green, a shutter banged in the wind. The hollow tree stood silent, holding its secret, but Miss Marple could feel the story beginning to shift. What appeared solid was already starting to crack. Chapter 5. The secrets begin to unravel. By Friday morning, the calm rhythm of Elmsworth had fully broken. The postman walked his route in silence, the vicar kept his curtains drawn, and even the church bell, which usually marked the hour with dutiful cheer, rang that day with a heavy, reluctant tone. It was as if the entire village had decided to whisper instead of breathe. Miss Marple noticed these small silences more than most. She had spent her life watching how people filled quiet moments, some with chatter, others with guilt. And Elmsworth, she decided, was growing full of guilty silences. She began her day with a visit to the vicarage, carrying a jar of Elspeth's quince jam as an excuse. Reverend Linton, a mild and usually welcoming man, greeted her with visible strain. Ah, Miss Marple, how kind. Please, do come in. His study smelled faintly of ink and tobacco. Papers lay untidily across the desk, unusual for him, she noted, and a single photograph stood turned face down beside the lamp. I wish to ask, she said gently, if poor Mr. Langdon attended service last Sunday. One hears he was a visitor at the inn. The vicar hesitated. He did come. Sat in the last pew. We spoke briefly after. He said he admired the sermon. Indeed, said Miss Marple softly. And yet you seem uneasy, Mr. Linton. Forgive me, but the matter appears to weigh heavily upon you. He smiled weakly. It is the strain of it all. I fear for our young men, Robert in particular. Her eyes lingered briefly on the turned photograph. A wise man once said that truth hides in plain sight, Reverend. Much like a photograph, face down only when one cannot bear to look. The vicar's hand twitched, and for a moment he looked ready to speak. But then the church bell rang outside, breaking the moment. "Excuse me, Miss Marple," he said quickly, standing. "I must prepare for a parish call." As he left, Miss Marple quietly turned the photo upright. It was of a woman, elegant, dark-haired, smiling faintly. And in the corner, in fine handwriting, "To Edward, with all my heart, E." She replaced it gently. Her suspicions, already forming, began to take firmer shape. At midday, she stopped by the Fox and Hound again. Mr. Partridge looked worse for wear, red-eyed, his hand shaking slightly as he poured drinks. "Another long night, Mr. Partridge?" she asked pleasantly. "Couldn't sleep," he muttered. "Too many police about. Terrible for business." Miss Marple's tone was mild. "I imagine it must be difficult, running an inn where such dreadful things occur, especially when one's guests keep secrets." He looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Oh, only that Mr. Langdon's letter, the one from me, must have caused quite a stir. People will wonder who she is. In a village, one can hardly hide anything for long." Mr. Partridge swallowed hard and said nothing. But Miss Marple noticed the way his eyes flicked toward the back door, the direction of the stables, and she made a quiet note of it. That evening, she spoke softly to Elspeth as they sat by the fire. "Elspeth, my dear, do you recall if Reverend Linton ever courted before his wife passed?" Her niece frowned. "Why, yes, years ago, before he took the parish here. There was talk of some lady from London, but it all ended rather suddenly." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "It seems London shadows have stretched further than we imagined. Mr. Langdon was no stranger here. And the letter signed E. I dare say it belonged to a woman who has reason to regret old choices." Elspeth shivered slightly. "You mean, the vicar's photograph?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly. "Or perhaps something even older. The past, my dear, has a way of planting roots, and sometimes those roots grow into hollow trees." Outside, a gust of wind rattled the windows. In the distance, thunder rolled faintly across the hills, a storm gathering, both in the sky and in the hearts of Elmsworth's people. Miss Marple laid down her knitting. The pattern, though still incomplete, was beginning to show its darker threads. Chapter 6. The Second Shock. The storm that had threatened all evening broke just after midnight. Wind howled down the lanes, rain lashed the rooftops, and the hollow tree groaned like an old, restless soul. Thunder rolled over Elmsworth, waking dogs and rattling shutters. Miss Marple, always a light sleeper, sat by her window with a candle and her knitting, watching the lightning flicker across the common. It was, she thought, the sort of night when secrets refused to stay buried. She wasn't wrong. At dawn, as the clouds broke and the village crept back into uneasy quiet, a new cry went up from the direction of the vicarage. Mrs. Elkins, the vicar's housekeeper, had discovered her employer's study in disarray, the window forced open, papers scattered, and Reverend Linton nowhere to be found. Within the hour, Inspector Garrow arrived again, drenched and irritable. "The man's run off," he declared grimly to the growing crowd outside the vicarage gate, "probably to save his own skin." Miss Marple, standing slightly apart from the rest, tilted her head. "Run off. Or taken, perhaps." Garrow frowned. "He left through the window, Miss Marple. Footprints lead toward the woods. That tells me flight, not foul play." "Does it?" she asked gently. "The woods are a curious destination for a clergyman seeking peace, especially after a storm." The inspector gave a tight sigh. "You always think there's more to the picture, don't you?" "There usually is," she said. "One only needs to look at the frame." By mid-morning, the gossip had reached a fever pitch. "The vicar's vanished," cried Mrs. Weller at the bakery. "They say he left a note." "No, no, it was a confession," said Mrs. Price, relishing every syllable. "He killed that London man, and now he's fled." But by noon, the truth, or a part of it, emerged. The The supposed note was nothing more than a torn scrap of sermon paper, with a single line scribbled across it in haste. "Forgive me, for the past cannot be buried twice." It was enough to turn whispers into hysteria. That afternoon, Miss Marple went to the vicarage herself. The police had already searched it, but they rarely noticed what wasn't obvious. She moved quietly through the study, eyes darting from object to object, the turned-down photograph still on the desk, the open drawer containing half-burned letters, the faint scent of lavender soap. She noticed something small, easily missed, a wet umbrella propped by the hearth. But the storm had ended hours before. Whoever had left it there had come after the rain. Miss Marple's gaze lifted to the window. Outside, the garden path showed faint footprints, smaller than the vicar's, lighter. And near the gate, she found a glint of something silver, a brooch shaped like a dove, its clasp broken. She held it in her gloved hand, her expression unreadable. A sound behind her made her turn. Mrs. Fielding stood in the doorway, pale and trembling. "Miss Marple, I came to see if I could help with the cleaning. Reverend Linton was always so kind." Her voice faltered as her eyes fell on the brooch. "You recognize it?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Fielding hesitated. Too long. "No, I don't think so." Miss Marple slipped the brooch into a handkerchief. "Oh, but you do, my dear. You see, it's the sort of piece a woman would never part with willingly, especially if it were a gift from a man she once loved." Mrs. Fielding's lips trembled, and she turned away, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. "It wasn't supposed to end like this," she whispered. "He said he'd make it right." "Who, Mrs. Fielding?" Miss Marple's tone was soft but firm. "Who did?" But the woman only shook her head and fled the room, leaving the faint scent of rain and fear behind her. That evening, as darkness fell again over Elmsworth, Miss Marple sat by the hearth, her knitting forgotten. Elspeth watched her anxiously. "You look troubled, Aunt Jane." "Troubled, yes," Miss Marple said slowly. "Because I believe we now have two victims, one dead, one missing, and the connection between them lies not in anger, but in love. Love that turned to guilt, and guilt that turned to silence." Elspeth swallowed. "Do you think Reverend Linton killed Mr. Langdon?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly in the firelight. "No, my dear. I think someone wants us all to believe that he did." Outside, the hollow tree loomed dark and silent against the night sky, but if one stood close enough, they might have heard the faintest sound within, like a sigh carried on the wind. A whisper, waiting to be heard. Chapter 7. Miss Marple Sets a Quiet Trap. By Saturday morning, the village had sunk into uneasy exhaustion. The murder, the vicar's disappearance, the endless rumors, all had left Elmsworth strained and hollow-eyed. Even the air seemed heavy with suspicion. Miss Marple, however, moved through it all as calmly as ever, her expression one of mild concern and gentle distraction. But behind her soft blue eyes, her thoughts worked with the precision of a clockmaker. She knew now that the truth lay not in the woods or the hollow tree, but in the small betrayals of daily life, the slips of the tongue, the glances avoided, the silences that lasted a beat too long. And so, she decided to listen. Her first visit that morning was to the Fox and Hound. Mr. Partridge was polishing glasses behind the bar, humming nervously. "Good morning, Mr. Partridge," Miss Marple said cheerfully. "Such dreadful weather for business, I imagine." He gave a strained laugh. "That's one way of putting it. Hardly anyone wants to drink when they think there's a murderer about." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple said mildly, setting down her knitting bag. "But then again, sometimes the murderer is the one offering the drink, don't you think?" The glass in his hand slipped slightly, producing a sharp clink. "Beg your pardon." "Oh, just an old woman's fancy," she smiled, watching him closely. "One hears so much in a village. About visitors from London, old love letters, silver walking sticks." For a moment, Mr. Partridge's face turned quite pale. Then he forced a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "You do have an imagination, Miss Marple." "Indeed," she said pleasantly, retrieving her bag. "Though I often find imagination and memory are very close cousins." When she left, he wiped his brow with a shaking hand. Her next stop was Mrs. Fielding's cottage. The curtains were drawn, and the woman herself looked worn and frightened when she opened the door. "Mrs. Fielding, I do hope you'll forgive me for calling unannounced. I've come to return something." Miss Marple produced the handkerchief-wrapped brooch and placed it on the table. "I found it at the vicarage," she said softly, "and I rather thought it might be yours." Mrs. Fielding stared at it, tears forming again. He wanted to end it, to tell the truth, but he said Mr. Langdon wouldn't let him. "Mr. Langdon," Miss Marple repeated gently. Then he knew Reverend Linton. Mrs. Fielding nodded. From before. Long ago, in London. Langdon knew everything, about Edward and me. He threatened to tell, to ruin him. Said he wanted money, or he'd write to the bishop. "And so you went to meet him," Miss Marple said softly. "At the hollow tree." Mrs. Fielding's breath caught. "I only meant to reason with him. But when I arrived, he was already dead. I ran. I was terrified." Miss Marple laid a hand over hers. "My dear, I believe you. But someone else was there that night. Someone who wanted you to find the body, and to take the blame if you spoke." Mrs. Fielding stared at her. "But who?" "The one person who would benefit from the vicar's ruin," Miss Marple said, her voice like silk. "Someone close enough to know your secret, and ambitious enough to use it." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid one last visit, to Lord Havilier's estate. He received her in his library, tall and polished as ever, with the detached charm of a man used to command. "To what do I owe the pleasure, Miss Marple?" he asked smoothly. "I've come about the vicar, my lord," she said kindly, "and about poor Mr. Langdon. I wonder, did you know him before his arrival in Elmsworth?" His eyes flickered, just once. "I can't say that I did." "Oh, that's odd," Miss Marple murmured, opening her knitting bag. "Because I found a cheque stub among Mr. Langdon's papers, made out to him by Havilier Estates. A generous sum, too." Lord Havilier's calm mask tightened. "You seem remarkably well informed, madam." "Only observant," she said, rising. "You see, blackmail is an expensive hobby, for both parties. And I rather think you grew tired of paying." He said nothing, but his hand gripped the edge of the desk. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The truth will out, my lord. It always does. Sometimes it only needs a little push. I dare say the inspector will be calling shortly." That evening, as rain began again to fall softly on the village roofs, Miss Marple sat by the fire. Elspeth looked at her nervously. "You didn't accuse him, did you, Aunt Jane?" "Accuse? Oh no, my dear. I merely invited him to tell the truth. Men like Lord Havilier rarely resist the need to control their stories. He will speak soon, whether to the inspector or in his own defense." She picked up her knitting again, the needles clicking softly in the quiet room. "Tomorrow," she said, "the hollow tree will whisper its last secret." Chapter 8. The Whisper from the Hollow Tree. Sunday morning broke clear and cold over Elmsworth. The rain had washed the air clean, leaving the village crisp and bright, though a strange silence still clung to its streets. By mid-morning, half the parish had gathered by the green, drawn by rumour, that Miss Marple had asked the inspector to meet her at the hollow tree. Some came out of curiosity, others from guilt, but all came with the sense that something was about to end. At the edge of the woods, the inspector stood waiting, his boots damp with dew. Beside him, Lord Havilier, dignified and composed, his cane tapping the ground in slow rhythm. Mrs. Fielding arrived last, her face pale but resolute, clutching a worn prayer book as if for courage. Then came Miss Marple, unhurried, neat, and smiling faintly as she always did. She carried a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Thank you all for coming," she said pleasantly. "It seemed only right that we meet here, where everything began." The hollow tree rose before them, ancient and gnarled, its trunk split open like an old wound. Sunlight slanted through its branches, dappling the clearing. Miss Marple knelt carefully beside the base and opened her parcel. Inside was a silver walking stick, its handle engraved with the Havilier crest. "I found this near the brook," she said softly. "It seems to have been there for some days." Lord Havilier's face didn't move, but his hand tightened around his cane. "It was used," Miss Marple continued, "to strike Mr. Langdon. The blow was not hard enough to kill instantly, but enough to make him fall. The rest, the water and the panic, finished it." The inspector frowned. "And you're certain it belongs to—" "To Lord Havilier," Miss Marple said gently. "But he did not mean to kill. He meant to silence." All eyes turned to the Lord. He lifted his chin, his voice calm but brittle. The man was blackmailing me. He knew of an old indiscretion, my brother's debts, a forged signature perhaps. He threatened scandal unless I paid. I came to reason with him, not to murder. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, my lord. But there was another there that night, someone who followed you. She turned to Mrs. Fielding. You saw him, didn't you? You saw the struggle and fled. But you dropped your brooch, which Mr. Langdon had earlier taken from you. It was meant to point blame at you. Mrs. Fielding gasped. Then it wasn't me he wanted to ruin. No, my dear, said Miss Marple softly. He wanted to ruin both of you, and in his greed he brought about his own end. The inspector closed his notebook. A tragic business, but the law will see to it. Lord Haverley, you'll come with me. But Miss Marple shook her head slightly. Inspector, I believe there is one more matter. She stepped closer to the hollow tree, touching the bark as if greeting an old friend. The vicar's disappearance. It troubled me, his hat by the river, his letters unanswered. But I think I see now. Reverend Linton was no victim. He was the witness. The inspector blinked. Witness? Yes, said Miss Marple. He saw the quarrel from the far side of the wood. He found the body later and knew what it meant. But rather than face the scandal, he chose to vanish, to let the dead bury the dead. There was a stunned silence. Even the birds seemed to pause. Then, he's alive. Mrs. Fielding whispered. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Alive, yes, though I dare say he will come forward soon enough. He's a good man at heart. And guilt, I find, is a poor companion for long journeys. As the inspector led Lord Haverley away, the villagers began to drift back toward the green. The hollow tree stood alone again, whispering in the soft wind that stirred its leaves. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, her eyes on the patch of earth where so much deceit had lain buried. Elspeth joined her quietly. It's over then, she asked. Miss Marple nodded. As much as these things ever are. Evil seldom dies, my dear, it simply waits for new soil to grow in. But truth, she smiled, looking up at the morning sky. Truth always finds a way through. She took Elspeth's arm, and together they walked back toward the village, the sound of church bells echoing faintly behind them, not for mourning, but for peace restored. Chapter 9. The Quiet Truth. That evening, the golden light of sunset lay across the village like a benediction. After days of turmoil, Elmsworth seemed to exhale. The bells had fallen silent, and only the crows over the churchyard disturbed the stillness. In her cosy sitting room at St. Marymead Cottage, Miss Marple sat beside the hearth, her knitting needles clicking gently. The fire burned low, the air faintly scented with lavender polish and tea. Elspeth sat opposite her, half lost in the armchair, looking more relieved than she had in days. It feels strange, doesn't it? She said softly. As if everything should go back to normal, but it doesn't. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It never quite does, my dear. People heal, but places remember. There was a pause. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 8. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once, then all were still again. Do you think the vicar will return? Elspeth asked. Oh, yes, said Miss Marple, pouring another cup of tea. He will come quietly, by the evening train. No one will notice, which is just how he prefers it. Guilt is a shadow that makes men hide until they are weary of darkness. She stirred her tea, eyes thoughtful. He will speak to the inspector, tell the truth, and Elmsworth will forgive him in time. The English village has a remarkable capacity for forgiveness, once it has exhausted its appetite for gossip. Elspeth smiled a little at that. And Lord Haverley? Gone to London for inquiry, said Miss Marple, but I suspect there will be leniency. Intent matters, and remorse more so. He is a proud man, but not a wicked one. For a while they sat in comfortable silence. The fire crackled softly, a log split with a quiet sigh. Then Elspeth leaned forward. Miss Marple, there's one thing I can't quite make sense of. How did you know about the walking stick? The inspector said nothing of it, and no one saw you find it. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Ah, that, my dear, was quite simple. When I first visited the inn, I noticed the empty space behind the bar where a stick had hung, and a faint mark of damp earth beneath it. Someone had replaced it recently, but the polish was fresher on one side. That told me it had been outside. Elspeth stared. So you knew all along? Miss Marple smiled, setting down her cup. Not knew, dear, only suspected. One must let people's own words prove what one's eyes merely guess. I've found that truth reveals itself best when given time and kindness. The clock chimed again. The room was growing dim. Miss Marple rose to light a lamp. The glow touched her face, calm, wise, a little sad. Such dreadful things, she murmured almost to herself. And yet, the world turns on such small follies. Pride, jealousy, fear. The murder was only the last whisper of what had long been festering. Perhaps that's what the old tree was telling us all along. The hollow tree? Elspeth asked. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. It had stood for centuries, hollowed by time and weather, but still living. Just like people, my dear. We survive our wounds, even if they never quite close. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters. The church bell gave a single toll in the distance. Miss Marple drew the curtains, folded her knitting, and looked once more toward the darkening woods beyond the garden wall. I do hope, she said, that whatever whispers through those branches tonight will be only the wind. Elspeth smiled sleepily. You think it still keeps secrets? Oh, undoubtedly, said Miss Marple with a faint, knowing smile. But that, my dear, is the way of all small villages. She turned down the lamp. The room faded into quiet shadow, the end of one mystery, and the soft beginning of another waiting just beyond the trees. Chapter 10. The Quiet Before the Storm. Autumn had returned to Elmsworth, soft and golden. The hedgerows were thick with berries, the lanes smelled faintly of wood smoke, and the cottages wore their ivy like velvet cloaks. Life had, for a time, returned to peace. Miss Marple's garden was thriving again, rows of dahlias and late roses catching the morning sun. She bent over her flower bed, trimming the last of the blooms, while Elspeth chattered nearby about the harvest fair preparations. It's to be at the vicarage this year, Elspeth said cheerfully. The Reverend Linton's come back at last, though I dare say he looks 10 years older. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Guilt and fresh air rarely suit one another, she murmured. Still, repentance, if sincere, tends to nourish the soul, much like compost nourishes roses. Elspeth giggled, though a shiver passed through her. You don't think there'll be more trouble? My dear, said Miss Marple, straightening up, there's always trouble if one listens carefully enough. The difference is only whether people admit to it. That afternoon, the postman brought an unexpected letter. Thick cream paper, London postmark, elegant handwriting. Miss Marple read it twice, her expression thoughtful. Then she placed it quietly on the table beside her teacup. Elspeth looked curious. From London? Yes, said Miss Marple. From an old friend, Lady Blackwood. She's coming to stay for a few days. Wishes to escape the noise of the city, as she puts it. How delightful. Elspeth said, We'll have company. Miss Marple's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Yes, delightful. For she remembered Lady Blackwood well, charming, gracious, and thoroughly accustomed to getting her own way. But wherever Lady Blackwood went, complications tended to follow like perfume. The lady arrived 3 days later in a sleek black motorcar that looked rather out of place among Elmsworth's winding lanes. The driver unloaded several cases, a hatbox, and a pair of caged songbirds before Lady Blackwood herself emerged. Tall, elegant, wrapped in a silver-grey coat. Jane, darling, she exclaimed, embracing Miss Marple lightly. How perfectly heavenly to see you again. I was desperate to get out of town. Dreadful people, dreadful noise. I need peace and civility. Miss Marple welcomed her warmly, though she noticed the faint tremor in her friend's gloved hands. You shall have both, my dear, she said gently. Elmsworth is most obliging in that regard. But later that evening, as Miss Marple poured the tea, she noticed Lady Blackwood glance toward the window again and again, as though expecting someone. At last, Miss Marple asked quietly, You seem anxious, dear. Surely nothing is wrong. Lady Blackwood smiled, too quickly. Oh, nothing at all. Only nerves, I suppose. Though, she hesitated. You won't think me silly, Jane, if I tell you I believe I'm being followed. Outside, The wind stirred the ivy along the garden wall. Somewhere, far off, a church bell tolled once, low and heavy. Miss Marple set down her cup. "Followed?" she repeated softly. "Yes," whispered Lady Blackwood. "Since last week. A man in a dark coat. I saw him at Paddington, and again at the inn this morning. He looked at me as if he knew." Miss Marple's eyes rested on her friend's pale face, calm, gentle, but piercing. "My dear," she said at last, "I think perhaps you are right to be here." The clock ticked. The wind sighed through the chimneys. And outside, beyond the tidy garden, a black motorcar sat parked in the lane, its engine still faintly warm. Chapter 11. The Guest Who Vanished. It was a night of restless wind, the sort that crept beneath doors and made the chimney sigh. Miss Marple had gone to bed later than usual, having sat up with Lady Blackwood until nearly midnight. They had taken tea in the sitting-room, speaking quietly of London society and its latest scandals, though Miss Marple had noticed her friend's eyes flick often toward the window, as though searching the dark. At last, Miss Marple had suggested rest, and Lady Blackwood had retired to the guest-room with her usual poise and a polite good night. All seemed peaceful then. But by dawn, something was wrong. When Elspeth came to bring in the morning post, she found the front door unlatched and a cold breeze drifting through the hall. The guest-room was empty. The bedclothes had been drawn back neatly, but the pillow bore the faintest impression of a head, as though someone had lain there only briefly. On the bedside table lay Lady Blackwood's travelling clock, ticking softly beside a half-empty glass of water. Her silver hairbrush rested in its case. But her handbag, and Lady Blackwood herself, were gone. Miss Marple arrived moments later, shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She stood very still, eyes sweeping the room. "Nothing taken but her bag?" she asked quietly. "Only that," said Elspeth, trembling. "Her coat is missing too, the grey one." Miss Marple moved closer to the window. The latch was unfastened, the curtain stirring slightly. Outside, faint footprints marked the damp earth below the sill, one large, one small. She straightened slowly. "Fetch Inspector Garrow," she said. "Tell him Lady Blackwood has vanished." By the time the inspector arrived, half the village knew. Rumour ran ahead of him like wildfire that there'd been a kidnapping, or worse, a murder. Garrow entered briskly, hat in hand. "Another mystery, Miss Marple? You do keep me busy." Miss Marple merely smiled. "I assure you, Inspector, it wasn't on my schedule." They went over the room together. No signs of struggle, no broken glass. But on the dressing table lay something strange, a folded scrap of paper, half torn, tucked under the brush case. Garrow unfolded it carefully. It was part of a letter, the same thick cream paper as Lady Blackwood's previous note. The writing was hurried, almost frantic. "Cannot meet again. It is too dangerous. If he finds out what we did." The rest was gone, torn cleanly down the middle. Garrow frowned. "He? Who is he?" Miss Marple's eyes were on the open window. "That," she said softly, "is precisely what we must discover." Outside, they followed the tracks across the damp grass and through the gate that led toward the old mill road. The prince stopped abruptly beside the lane, where the gravel had been disturbed by tire marks. "A car," said Garrow grimly, "drove off before dawn." Miss Marple bent down, brushing the edge of the track with her gloved fingers. Heavy wheels, and one tire slightly worn on the left. Not local. She looked up at the inspector. "Do you recall the black motor car that lingered by the church yesterday evening?" "I do," he said. "London plates." Then Miss Marple murmured, "I think our visitor's disappearance was not spontaneous at all, but arranged." That afternoon, the villagers gathered in knots outside the post office, whispering. "She's been taken," declared Mrs. Price. "I said she looked nervous." "They say she had jewels," added another. "Worth a fortune." Miss Marple passed them on her way to the green, her expression mild, but her mind far from calm. She had seen something earlier, a small detail others had missed. When she reached the cottage again, she went straight to the sitting room, where a single flower had fallen from the vase on the mantel. She picked it up, a white camellia, bruised at the edge. Lady Blackwood had worn such a flower in her coat when she arrived. Miss Marple turned it slowly between her fingers. "So," she murmured, "you didn't leave unwillingly, my dear. You left a trail." That night, as the wind rose once more over Elmsworth, Miss Marple sat awake by the fire, the torn letter beside a teacup. Somewhere far away, a car engine echoed faintly down the valley, then faded into silence. Miss Marple's knitting lay untouched in her lap. Her eyes were thoughtful, steady, and quietly sad. "Fear makes us foolish," she whispered to herself. "But guilt makes us vanish." Chapter 12. The Letter from London. The next morning dawned grey and chill, with a fine mist lying over the village like breath upon glass. Elmsworth awoke subdued, cautious, as if the air itself remembered the whisper of last night's disappearance. At 9:30, the postman brought a single envelope to Miss Marple's cottage. It bore a London stamp and no return address. The handwriting was unfamiliar, precise, slanted, almost mechanical. Miss Marple examined it carefully before opening it. The paper was expensive, faintly scented with sandalwood. Inside was a single line typed neatly on cream stationery. "She is safe. Do not look for her." No signature. No clue to who had sent it. Elspeth gasped when she read it. Safe. Then she's alive. Miss Marple's expression didn't change. Safe is a comforting word, my dear, though people often use it when they mean something quite different. She turned the letter over. The back was blank, save for a faint smudge of violet ink near the fold, the kind used in hotel writing desks. Later that morning, Inspector Garrow arrived again, looking weary and irritable. "Another anonymous message," he muttered. "This case is turning into one of those puzzles you enjoy, Miss Marple." She smiled faintly. "I prefer crochet to crime, Inspector, but I suppose one must occupy one's mind." He frowned down at the letter. "We'll trace it, of course. Likely from London. Still, this smells like ransom or scandal. Did she have enemies?" "Most people of her charm and fortune have both," Miss Marple said softly. "But I don't believe this is a matter of ransom. Lady Blackwood had the look of someone running from something, not toward it." Garrow sighed. "You think she staged her own disappearance?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled slightly. "Not staged, Inspector. Arranged, but perhaps not by her." By noon, the village was buzzing again. Mrs. Price insisted she'd seen a man by the station carrying a lady's suitcase that morning, while young Tommy Finch claimed he'd spotted a motorcar near the bridge at dawn. Miss Marple listened politely to all of it but said very little. Instead, she took a quiet walk to the vicarage. Reverend Linton greeted her at the door, still pale and thin from his long absence. "Miss Marple. You've heard, of course? Shocking business." "Yes," she said gently. "Quite distressing. I was hoping, however, that you might still have the parish guest book, the one used when visitors come to stay." The vicar blinked. "Why, yes, though I can't imagine." "I only wondered," Miss Marple said, "whether Lady Blackwood signed it." They looked together, and there it was, her elegant signature, dated 3 days before. But beneath it, faintly penciled, someone had added another name, Mr. H.C. Lang. "Lang," the vicar murmured. "We've no resident by that name." Miss Marple's lips pressed together thoughtfully. "No. But I dare say we have a ghost of one." That evening, Miss Marple sat once again by her fire, examining the letter, the torn note, and her memories. Lady Blackwood's nervous glances, her insistence on peace and quiet, her claim of being followed. And now, a mysterious man sharing the name Lang, the same as the unfortunate Mr. Langdon from the Hollow Tree affair months before. Coincidence? Miss Marple had long ago stopped believing in coincidence. She took out her address book, flipped to B, and wrote a short telegram. To Colonel Melrose, Scotland Yard. Urgent. Please inquire if any Mr. H.C. Lang has arrived in London from Elmsworth vicinity within 24 hours. Connection with Lady Blackwood possible. Kindly confidential. J. Marple. She sealed it, handed it to Elspeth for posting, and returned to her chair. Outside, the mist thickened, blurring the church spire and muffling the sound of passing wheels. Somewhere in that haze, Miss Marple knew, the truth was moving, quietly, deliberately, toward her. She folded her hands and smiled faintly. "If you wish to vanish, my dear Lady Blackwood," she murmured, "you've chosen quite the stage." Chapter 13. The Man in the Stationmaster's Book. By the next morning, the mist had lifted, leaving behind a pale autumn sun that glimmered weakly over the rooftops of Elmsworth. Miss Marple, wrapped in her grey shawl and clutching her ever-present handbag, made her way to the small railway station at the edge of the village. The stationmaster, Mr. Clegg, was a round little man with spectacles and the perpetually startled look of someone who had once missed a train and never quite recovered from it. He greeted her with a nervous smile. "Morning, Miss Marple. Terrible goings-on, I hear. That fine lady from London vanished into thin air, they say." "Into thin fog, rather," Miss Marple corrected gently. "And fog can hide many things, Mr. Clegg. Tell me, was there anything unusual at the station the morning she disappeared?" Mr. Clegg scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Now you mention it. Yes, there was. A pair of early travellers. Didn't take the main train, mind you, the goods line pickup, 5:30. Odd business, that." "Two travellers?" Miss Marple asked. He nodded. "A lady, dressed fine, city sort, and a tall man in a dark coat. Didn't speak much. The fellow bought the tickets, and I remember his name because he signed the ledger for a parcel delivery. H.C. Lang." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her knitting bag rustled slightly as she gripped its handles tighter. "You saw their faces clearly?" "As clear as this morning's sun, miss. Though I'd swear she kept her veil down." "Did they say where they were bound?" Mr. Clegg flipped through the big brown ledger on his desk and pointed. "Paddington. One way." Later that day, Inspector Garrow came by the cottage again to find Miss Marple already preparing a small travelling bag. "You're going to London?" he asked, incredulous. "Yes," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I've always found the truth rather enjoys being followed." "Then you'd best take care," Garrow warned. "If this Lang fellow is the same man connected to that old hollow tree case, you may be walking into danger." "Danger," Miss Marple said with a faint smile, "is often far less frightening when one's seen enough of it in others. Besides, dear Inspector, I'm only visiting a friend." "Who?" "Lady Blackwood," she replied, "though I expect she doesn't yet know it." By afternoon, she was aboard the London train, a modest compartment with red velvet seats and a faint smell of coal smoke. As the countryside rolled past in streaks of gold and brown, Miss Marple watched quietly, her eyes thoughtful. The names and faces turned in her mind like pages in a well-read novel. Lady Blackwood, elegant but afraid. A man calling himself H.C. Lang. A letter saying do not look for her. And, buried beneath it all, the memory of another man, Frederick Langdon, who had died months before near the hollow tree. Two names, two fates. Coincidence? Or a legacy unfinished? Miss Marple's instinct whispered the latter. When she arrived at Paddington, the station was bustling with the usual evening rush, porters shouting, steam hissing, the smell of soot and rain. She found the stationmaster's office and, after polite conversation and a modest bribe of good manners, learned that 2 tickets to a small private hotel in Bloomsbury had indeed been booked under the name Lang. Bloomsbury, Miss Marple murmured to herself. So convenient for one wishing to remain visible, yet unseen. She took a cab through the grey London streets, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The city looked washed out, tired, like an old actress waiting for her cue. When the cab stopped before the Somerset House Hotel, Miss Marple stepped out, paid the driver, and entered quietly. The clerk behind the desk, a thin young man with pomaded hair, looked up with polite disinterest. "Good evening," Miss Marple said kindly. "I believe my niece, Lady Blackwood, is staying here with Mr. Lang." The young man hesitated just a moment too long. I'm afraid I can't discuss the guests, madam." "Of course," Miss Marple said sweetly. "But you might tell me whether she left word about her luggage. The grey trunk, perhaps." The clerk's eyes flickered, and that was all she needed. He recovered quickly, muttering something about privacy and rules, but Miss Marple's mind was already working. She thanked him, turned to leave, and in the reflection of the glass door saw the clerk pick up the telephone. "Ah," she murmured to herself, stepping out into the drizzle. "So they know I'm here." Back in her cab, she gave the driver a new address, one belonging to an old friend in Chelsea. The engine started, and the car pulled away. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her expression calm. But her thoughts ran swift and sharp. Lady Blackwood had not been taken. She had gone willingly. And yet, the fear in her eyes had been real. There was only one explanation that fit both truths. "She's protecting someone," Miss Marple whispered, as London's lights began to blur in the rain. But from what, or from whom? Chapter 14. The Hotel in Bloomsbury. London had always seemed to Miss Marple like a place that never quite went to sleep, it merely changed its mask. Even in the grey drizzle of late afternoon, the pavements of Bloomsbury gleamed with restless footsteps, umbrellas nodding like polite conspirators in the rain. Miss Marple arrived at her friend's small Chelsea flat just as the street lamps were being lit. Her friend, Mrs. Ellison, a retired head mistress with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, greeted her with surprise. "Jane Marple. You in London, and without a letter first? Heavens, this must be serious." "It is," Miss Marple admitted, removing her damp gloves. "A matter involving a frightened woman, a false name, and a man who ought to be dead." Mrs. Ellison blinked. "Well, that's a proper mouthful for tea time. Sit down and tell me everything." By the time the teapot was empty, Mrs. Ellison looked both alarmed and fascinated. "So you believe this Mr. Lang is somehow connected to the murder in Elmsworth?" Miss Marple nodded. "Not merely connected, my dear. I believe he may be the same man, or his brother, or someone who has taken his name to hide behind." "And Lady Blackwood? She's running from something, or protecting someone she loves. The trouble is, I cannot yet tell which." Mrs. Ellison considered this. "What do you mean to do?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Why, visit the Somerset House Hotel, of course. The young clerk there struck me as a man who knows more than he dare say." "Jane," Mrs. Ellison said, half scolding, half admiring, "you'll get yourself killed one of these days." "Possibly," Miss Marple replied mildly, "but one does so prefer to know why, if it comes to that." That evening, Miss Marple returned to Bloomsbury, this time dressed more plainly, a dark coat, a small hat, and an umbrella that had seen better days. She entered the Somerset House Hotel quietly, as if she had every right to be there. The same young clerk was on duty, looking harried. Miss Marple gave him a kindly smile. "Good evening again," she said. "I do hope you've had no trouble after our earlier conversation." He stiffened, clearly nervous. "None at all, madam. None at all." "Splendid," said Miss Marple. "Then perhaps you might be so kind as to let me know whether the gentleman, Mr. Lang, received his parcel? It was rather important." The clerk blinked. "Parcel?" "Yes, the one from Elmsworth station. Marked private documents." His mouth opened, then closed. Miss Marple saw the hesitation, a flicker of truth fighting with fear. Before he could answer, the sound of a door opening interrupted them. A tall man in a black overcoat descended the staircase, calm, composed, with pale eyes that held no warmth. "Mr. Lang." The clerk straightened instantly. Miss Marple turned, pretending mild surprise. "Oh," she said brightly. "How curious. I was just inquiring after you, sir." The man's expression didn't change. "Indeed." His voice was low, deliberate. "And may I ask why?" Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. "Because, Mr. Lang, you appear to be the only man who can tell me whether Lady Blackwood is safe." Something flickered in his eyes, not fear, exactly, but irritation. "You are mistaken, madam. I am not acquainted with any such lady." "Of course not," said Miss Marple softly. "Just as you're not acquainted with the hollow tree near Elmsworth, I suppose." Now he froze. For a brief second, his composure cracked, the faintest tightening around the jaw, the flicker of recognition in his gaze. Then it was gone. "I think you should leave, Mrs. Marple," she said gently. "Miss Marple. From St. Mary Mead." He gave her a small, cold smile. "Ah yes. The amateur sleuth. I've heard of you." "And I of you," she said. "Though under a rather different name, Mr. Langdon." This time, the reaction was unmistakable. His eyes darkened, his hands clenched at his sides. "I must insist you leave," he said, voice tight. "Now." Miss Marple inclined her head. "As you wish. But you might consider, before I go, whether your lady companion feels as free as you do." She turned and walked calmly toward the door, the click of her heels steady against the marble floor. Behind her, she could almost hear the young clerk's panic and the man's angry whisper. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft but relentless. Miss Marple stood beneath the awning for a moment, thinking. She had confirmed what she needed. Mr. Lang was alive, and dangerous. Lady Blackwood was with him, not as an accomplice, but as a captive of circumstance. But there was something else, something nagging at the edge of her mind. That name. Langdon. It was more than a coincidence. The murdered man in Elmsworth, Frederick Langdon, had a brother who vanished years ago under suspicion of fraud. Could this be him? Could that be the root of everything, a crime buried beneath another? Miss Marple sighed softly. 2 trees, she murmured. One hollow, and one still growing from rotten roots. She raised her umbrella and began to walk, her small figure vanishing into the lamplight as London's rain whispered around her. Chapter 15. The Letter from Lady Blackwood. The following morning dawned pale and uncertain, the London fog settling like damp lace over the windows of Mrs. Allison's Chelsea flat. Miss Marple was already awake, sitting near the small writing desk, a teacup cooling at her elbow. She had not slept well. All night, her mind had chased fragments, names, faces, and the soft whisper of the hollow tree. The scene kept returning, the old oak, hollow at its heart, the cold body found beneath it. Frederick Langdon, dead and disgraced. And now his brother, or his ghost, walking free in Bloomsbury. At 8 o'clock sharp, Mrs. Allison shuffled into the sitting room, still in her dressing gown, holding an envelope between 2 fingers as if it was slightly distasteful. This came for you, Jane. Delivered by hand. No return address. Miss Marple looked up, eyes narrowing just slightly. By hand, you say? Yes. A young boy. Vanished before I could ask who sent it. Said it was for the old lady from the country, which I assume meant you. Miss Marple smiled faintly. One does get used to that. She took the envelope carefully. The paper was thick, the handwriting neat but trembling, a woman's hand. When she opened it, a faint scent of violets rose into the air. The letter read, Miss Marple, please, do not come to see me again. You are in far greater danger than you understand. The man you met last night is not who he claims to be, but neither am I. I beg you, for your own safety, return to St. Mary Mead and forget what you've learned. There are things buried that must remain so. L.B. Miss Marple read it twice, her lips pressed together. Then she folded it neatly and set it aside. Mrs. Allison was staring at her. Well? Who's it from? Lady Blackwood, said Miss Marple quietly. And she's lying. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a cab to the British Library, her expression mild as always, but her thoughts turning fast. She asked for the public archives and, after some polite persistence, found what she sought, old society pages, birth announcements, and legal notices. Frederick Langdon, she murmured, scanning the yellowed paper. Married Beatrice Blackwood, 1918. Divorced, 1923. And afterward, yes. His brother, Henry Charles Langdon, charged with embezzlement in 1925, disappeared before trial. The name leapt off the page. H.C. Lang. So the man in Bloomsbury was not a stranger at all. He was Henry Langdon, Frederick's disgraced brother, living under a shortened name, using his dead brother's tragedy as a screen. And Lady Blackwood. Beatrice Langdon once upon a time. No wonder she had fled. That evening, back in Chelsea, Miss Marple wrote a short letter of her own, sealed it, and handed it to Mrs. Allison. Would you be so kind as to have this delivered to the Somerset House Hotel? She asked. Mrs. Allison frowned. Jane, you're not about to start a duel with this man, are you? Miss Marple smiled gently. Heavens, no. I'm merely inviting him to one. An hour later, the reply came, not in writing this time, but in person. Mrs. Allison had gone upstairs to rest, leaving Miss Marple alone in the lamplight when the doorbell rang. She opened it to find the young hotel clerk standing there, pale and anxious. Mr. Lang wishes to speak with you, he stammered. Privately. He says it's urgent. Miss Marple studied the boy a moment, then nodded. Very well. Tell him I'll come. But not to the hotel. If he wishes to talk, it will be here, in my friend's sitting room. In 1 hour. The clerk looked uneasy. I don't know if he'll. Tell him Miss Marple insists, she said firmly, and closed the door. At precisely 9 o'clock, there was a knock. The same tall man entered, removing his hat, his eyes sharp and cold. You are persistent, Miss Marple, he said. I've often found that persistence and tea solve nearly everything, she replied, gesturing toward a chair. Please, sit. He remained standing. You've been meddling. Asking questions that could ruin lives. Miss Marple looked up at him mildly. Lives seem to have been ruined already, don't you think? Frederick Langdon dead. His widow in hiding. And you, Mr. Langdon, living under a borrowed name. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, very softly, you've no idea what you're dealing with. Oh, but I do, Miss Marple said. A woman who loved one brother, married him, lost him, and now protects the other because she cannot bear to see him hanged. It's quite a simple tragedy, really. His face hardened. You think you understand everything. Not everything, Miss Marple said. Only enough to know that Lady Blackwood didn't kill your brother, and neither did you. But someone did, and that someone has been whispering through every lie you've told since. The silence that followed was thick as smoke. Then, without a word, he turned and left. After the door closed, Miss Marple sat quietly for a long time, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. She knew what she had seen in his eyes. Fear, yes, but not guilt. There was another player still hidden in this game. Someone neither of them had yet named. And tomorrow she would go back to Elmsworth, back to the hollow tree, where the truth, at last, would have to come out. Chapter 16. Return to Elmsworth. The following morning, the London air felt heavier than usual, as if it too carried the weight of unspoken secrets. Miss Marple rose early, took her tea without sugar, and packed her small travelling bag with calm precision. She left Mrs. Allison's flat with a polite farewell and boarded the first train bound for the countryside. As the engine pulled away from Paddington, she watched the grey city fade behind her. The smoke, the noise, the endless turning wheels, all swallowed slowly by the quiet green of the English landscape. By the time the train reached Elmsworth, the afternoon sun was soft and low, casting long golden stripes through the windows of the small station. Miss Marple stepped onto the platform and took a deep breath of the cool, clean air. Elmsworth had not changed. The same white cottages, the same shop windows filled with apples and biscuits, the same faint smell of wood smoke drifting from chimneys. But there was something else now, a kind of stillness that hadn't been there before. The villagers, once curious and talkative, lowered their voices as she passed. They all knew why she'd come back. At the post office, Miss Hartwell, the postmistress, nearly dropped her ledger when she saw her. Miss Marple. We thought you'd gone for good. Back in the thick of it again, are you? Miss Marple smiled kindly. Only a little tidy up, my dear. Some loose threads that need stitching. Miss Hartwell hesitated. You'll be wanting to see the constable, then? He's been fretting ever since the London inspector took over. Says there's more to it than they found. There usually is, said Miss Marple gently. Would you be so kind as to send word to him that I'll call this afternoon? Miss Hartwell nodded eagerly. Of course, Miss Marple. And oh, you'll want your letters. 2 came for you while you were away. Miss Marple took the envelopes and stepped outside into the pale sunlight. One was from Mrs. Allison, a brief note saying all was well. The other bore no return address, only her name written in a firm, masculine hand. She opened it slowly. Do not return to the hollow tree. Some roots are better left untouched. No signature. But she didn't need one. Mr. Langdon, she murmured. Or someone writing for him. That afternoon, she walked along the quiet country road leading to the hollow tree. It stood at the edge of Blackwood Hollow, an old oak, gnarled and partly hollowed by age, with branches twisted like arms reaching for the sky. The autumn leaves carpeted the ground in bronze and gold, and the air was heavy with the scent of earth and decay. It was here that Frederick Langdon had been found months ago, and where so many secrets had begun. Miss Marple stopped near the tree and studied the ground carefully. The police had dug and trampled through it before, but the earth had settled again, uneven, soft in some places, hard in others. She crouched, brushing a gloved hand over a small mound of moss. Something glinted faintly beneath it. A tiny piece of broken glass, the sort used in perfume bottles. She turned it over in her hand thoughtfully. How very curious, she murmured. Lady Blackwood always favoured violet scent. And yet, when Frederick Langdon had died, the scent on his clothes had been jasmine. That single difference, that small inconsistency, suddenly opened a new path in her mind. Someone else had been there that night. Someone who had borrowed Lady Blackwood's scent, or her bottle, to mislead the investigation. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her eyes scanning the edge of the woods. "No," she said softly. "She didn't kill him. But someone wanted us all to think she did." At that moment, Constable Hughes appeared from the lane, puffing slightly from the walk. "Miss Marple. I had word from Miss Hartwell. You're back, then?" "Yes, Constable. And just in time, I think. Tell me, did the police ever find that missing handkerchief? The one embroidered with the initials BL?" Hughes frowned. "No, vanished entirely. They said it must have burned in the fireplace." "Or been taken," said Miss Marple softly. "And if it was, I believe I know who has it." The constable blinked. "You do?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh yes. And if I'm correct, they'll come for me tonight, because they know the hollow tree is about to speak again." That evening, as dusk fell over Elmsworth, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. She lit a single lamp, placed the broken perfume glass on the table, and poured herself a cup of tea. The village was quiet. Too quiet. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and far away, a dog barked once, sharply, as if startled. Miss Marple didn't move. She only watched the window, calm and steady, waiting. Because she knew someone was coming. And this time, she was ready. Chapter 17. The Midnight Visitor. The wind had risen after dusk, carrying with it the first whispers of rain. Elmsworth lay hushed under its blanket of mist, the cottages dimly glowing through fog like lanterns half forgotten in a dream. Miss Marple sat by the small fire in her cottage, her knitting untouched beside her, her eyes on the window. She was not frightened, she rarely was, but she was alert, very still, like a cat watching a closed door. On the table before her lay three things: the shard of glass from the hollow tree, the unsigned warning letter, and a small pocket torch. The clock struck 11. Outside, the village road was silent. Then, footsteps. They were soft, hesitant at first, then firmer. Gravel crunched beneath boots. Miss Marple reached over, turned down the lamp, and waited. A faint knock came at the door. She didn't answer. Another knock, louder this time. Then a voice, low and cautious. "Miss Marple. Please, it's me." Miss Marple exhaled softly. She recognized the voice at once, Lady Blackwood. She rose, unlocked the door, and stepped back as the woman entered, her cloak damp from mist, her eyes wide and glistening with fear. "Forgive me," Lady Blackwood whispered. "I had no choice but to come. They'll have seen me." "Sit down, my dear," Miss Marple said calmly, guiding her to the chair near the fire. "No one followed you." "You don't understand," Lady Blackwood said, clutching her gloves. "He's here, in the village. He knows I've written to you." Miss Marple poured her a cup of tea. "Then it's fortunate I prefer to receive my visitors at night. One learns so much more when people are afraid." The lady looked up sharply. "You think I've lied to you?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "you've told me the truth you could bear, not the truth as it was." Lady Blackwood's lips trembled. "He wasn't supposed to die." "Frederick." She nodded. "He came that night, to the hollow tree, to confront his brother. Henry had been blackmailing me for months. I was desperate. Frederick found out and went to meet him. I followed, to stop them both." Her voice broke. "When I arrived, Frederick was already on the ground. Henry was standing over him, but there was someone else. A man in the shadows. I saw the glint of something in his hand. Then I fainted. When I awoke, they were both gone. Later, Henry told me Frederick had fallen, struck his head. I wanted to believe him." Miss Marple's eyes never left her face. "But you didn't." No, a tear slipped down Lady Blackwood's cheek. "When I saw him again in London, I knew he was hiding something, something worse than guilt. I thought if I ran with him, I could find out what it was. But now—" She looked toward the window, her voice a whisper. "Now I think someone else knows." Miss Marple stood, her gaze turning to the dark pane of glass. Beyond the window, a shadow moved. "Don't speak," she murmured. The door handle turned. Lady Blackwood gasped softly. Miss Marple reached for the torch and flicked it on, a beam of white light cutting through the dim room and landing squarely on a man's face. Constable Hughes. Good heavens! Miss Marple exclaimed. Whatever are you doing creeping about like a burglar? Hughes raised both hands, startled. I saw movement, Miss Marple. Thought someone was breaking in. I came round the back. He stopped short, his eyes landing on Lady Blackwood. Oh, I see. Do you? Miss Marple said dryly. Then perhaps you can also see what she's running from. Hughes frowned. I thought she'd left the country. Inspector Garrow said. Inspector Garrow, Miss Marple interrupted gently, said many things. Not all of them accurate. Lady Blackwood rose suddenly, trembling. He's here, she whispered again. I felt it, he followed me. A loud crack of thunder rolled through the night. The lights flickered. And then, from the road outside, came the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel. Miss Marple turned to Hughes. Lock the door, she said calmly. And fetch my shawl. I expect we're about to have another caller. The knock, when it came, was sharp, 3 times, deliberate. Miss Marple opened the door herself. Henry Langdon stood there, rain dripping from his coat, eyes cold as glass. Enough of this nonsense, he said. Beatrice, come with me. Lady Blackwood shrank back. Henry, please. He stepped inside without invitation. You've made a fool of us both, he hissed. Talking to this old woman, stirring up the past. Miss Marple's voice cut through the air like a blade. The past, Mr. Langdon, is what you've been living off for far too long. And I think it's about to stop. He turned to her sharply. You know nothing. Oh, but I do. She took a step closer, her eyes bright. Your brother didn't die by accident. And you didn't kill him. But you know who did. For the first time, Henry's composure faltered. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. A knock, softer this time, sounded on the door behind him. All 3 turned. The door creaked open slowly. And there, in the rain, stood Inspector Garrow. His expression was grave. Henry Charles Langdon, he said, I believe it's time we all heard the truth. Chapter 18, Confession at Dawn. The rain came down in silver sheets, steady and cold. Miss Marple's cottage felt smaller now, the air dense with fear and unspoken words. Inspector Garrow closed the door behind him and shook the rain from his coat. He looked from Henry Langdon to Lady Blackwood, then to Miss Marple, who stood calm and unreadable by the hearth. Quite a gathering, he said quietly. Seems I've arrived just in time. Henry's jaw tightened. If you've come to arrest me, Inspector, you'll regret it. I've done nothing. On the contrary, Garrow interrupted. You've done a great deal. The problem is, not all of it's been legal. Henry's face flushed. You've no proof. Miss Marple tilted her head. Oh, I think we have more than you imagine. You see, I found the missing piece of glass, the one you dropped when you took the letter from the hollow tree. Garrow raised an eyebrow. You did. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. And what's more, it bears traces of candle wax and ash, from a fire started recently in the old rectory ruins. She turned her eyes on Henry. Tell me, Mr. Langdon, what were you burning there? Henry's mouth opened, then closed again. He swallowed hard. It was old correspondence, Frederick's, mostly. I wanted it gone. Letters, Miss Marple said softly. Letters in which your brother accused you of blackmail and threatened to expose your debts to the estate trustees. Lady Blackwood gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. You told me you burned them for my sake. Henry turned to her sharply. Beatrice, you don't understand. Oh, I understand, she said bitterly. You used me. All this time, you said it was for love, but it was for money. Inspector Garrow stepped forward. And when Frederick tried to stop you, there was a struggle, and he died. No. Henry shouted. That's not how it happened. The room fell silent but for the ticking of the clock. Miss Marple's voice, when it came, was very quiet. Then tell us, Henry. Tell us how it happened. Henry looked at them all, at the small fire crackling, at the window streaked with rain, at Lady Blackwood's tearful eyes. His shoulders sagged. He wanted to see her, he said finally. Frederick. He knew I was in trouble, with the gambling debts, the trustees, and he said Beatrice might help. I told him to stay away from her, that she was mine. We argued. He tried to strike me. I pushed him, but he slipped. Hit his head on the stone. His voice trembled. I swear I didn't mean it. I panicked. There was blood, so much blood. Then someone came, a man, and said he'd help me. He told me to go. I never saw his face. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A man, you say? Tall? Wore gloves, perhaps. Henry looked startled. Yes, how did you? Because, she said, you weren't the only one he helped. Inspector Garrow frowned. You mean? Yes, Miss Marple said, turning toward Lady Blackwood. The same man followed her that night, the same man who's been watching us since the beginning. The blackmailer had a helper, Inspector. Someone who made sure every secret in Elmsworth stayed valuable and deadly. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. Who is he? Lady Blackwood whispered. Miss Marple looked toward the window, toward the faint silhouette standing just beyond the glass. His name, she said, is Thomas Reed, the groundskeeper. A loud crash of thunder split the air. When the flash of lightning lit the window again, the silhouette was gone. Inspector Garrow rushed to the door, flinging it open into the storm. Reed. Stop. But the road outside was empty, save for the rain. Henry sank into the chair, face pale. Good Lord, it's been him all along. Miss Marple turned back to the fire, her voice soft but certain. Yes, Mr. Langdon. He cleaned up after you, and made a fortune selling your sins to others. Lady Blackwood shivered. Then Frederick's death. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Was no accident. Reed made sure of that, and of everything that followed. The wind moaned outside, rattling the windows like distant voices. Garrow returned, soaked to the skin. He's gone, he said grimly. Vanished into the woods. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the darkness beyond the window. Then we'd best be quick, Inspector. The hollow tree keeps secrets, but not forever. Chapter 19. The Chase Through Elmsworth Woods. The rain had turned the world into a blur of grey and silver. Trees leaned under the wind's weight, their branches thrashing like frightened things. The lane outside Miss Marple's cottage was already flooding when Inspector Garrow and 2 constables set out, their lanterns swinging wildly in the dark. Miss Marple followed a few paces behind, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. He'll head for the woods, she said quietly. He knows them better than anyone. Garrow glanced back, frowning. You shouldn't be out in this, Don't be silly, Inspector. You'll never find the right path without me. Lightning split the sky, showing the outline of Elmsworth Woods in the distance, black and jagged against the flash. The rain hissed against the hedgerows. Somewhere ahead, a gate creaked open, then slammed shut again. That way. Garrow barked, and they plunged forward into the mud. The woods swallowed them almost at once. The air was thick, the ground uneven, roots like twisted ropes beneath their feet. Lantern light danced across tree trunks slick with rain. Miss Marple moved slower than the others, but her eyes were sharp. There, she called softly, pointing toward the faint glimmer of movement. By the old well. They crept closer, their footsteps muffled by wet leaves. The shape ahead, tall, broad-shouldered, turned sharply. A gun flashed in the dark. Down! Garrow shouted. The shot whined past, splintering bark inches from Miss Marple's head. For a heartbeat, all was still but the rain. Then Reed's voice, hoarse and furious, broke through the storm. Stay back. I've nothing to lose now. Garrow's voice was steady. Thomas Reed, you're under arrest for the murder of Frederick Langdon, and for blackmail. Drop the weapon. But Reed only laughed, a sound that sent a chill through every man there. Murder? You don't know the half of it, Inspector. That fool Langdon was already dead when I found him. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice cutting through the rain. Then you'd best tell us who killed him, before the hollow tree does. Reed froze. You don't know what you're talking about. Oh, but I do, she said softly. The hollow tree hides what people wish to forget. But it whispers, too, and I listened. For a long moment, the only sound was the storm. Then Reed gave a strangled laugh. You think you're clever, old woman? All right then, you want the truth? Fine. He gestured toward the darkness behind him. It was Lady Blackwood. She came that night. She'd quarreled with Frederick, about money, about the letters. He threatened her. She hit him. Harder than she meant to, I suppose. Miss Marple's expression didn't change. And you helped her hide the body. I buried him under the hollow tree, Reed said bitterly. She paid me to keep quiet, and when she stopped paying, I made sure she remembered who I was. Garrow's jaw tightened. You're lying. Am I? Reed sneered. Go dig under that cursed tree and see for yourself. Miss Marple's eyes glistened in the lantern light. And what of Henry Langdon? She asked quietly. Why did you let him believe it was his doing? Reed's smile was twisted. Because he was weak. Because it was easier. And because guilt keeps people quiet. A crash of thunder shook the ground. Garrow lunged forward, but Reed bolted, into the trees, through the mud and rain. The constables gave chase, their shouts echoing. Miss Marple called after them. No farther. The stream's overrun, it'll pull him under. But her warning came too late. A cry pierced the storm, sharp, desperate, then vanished into the roar of water. When the lanterns finally found him, Reed was gone. The swollen stream had swallowed him whole. They stood in silence, rain dripping from their hats, breaths heavy in the cold night air. Inspector Garrow sighed, weary. That's the end of him, then. Miss Marple shook her head slowly. No, Inspector. Only the beginning of the truth. He looked at her, puzzled. Because, she said softly, Reed may have been cruel, but he wasn't entirely wrong. The lady was there that night. Garrow frowned. Lady Blackwood. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. And before morning, she'll have to tell us everything. Lightning flashed once more, and in that brief light, the hollow tree loomed ahead of them, black and silent, its hollow mouth yawning like a wound. Chapter 20. The Whisper Beneath the Roots. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the village draped in mist. Elmsworth lay hushed beneath a pale sky, its lanes slick with rain, its fields veiled in silver fog. Miss Marple stood by the hollow tree at the edge of the woods. The air still smelled of wet earth and moss. A few constables were already there, spades in hand, waiting for Inspector Garrow's order. Right, said Garrow grimly. He said the body was buried here. Let's see if he was telling the truth. Miss Marple watched quietly as they began to dig. Each scrape of the spade echoed strangely in the stillness. The hollow tree loomed above them, its ancient trunk hollowed and twisted, like something that had seen too much of human sorrow. After a few minutes, one of the men stopped. Sir, he called softly, there's something here. They knelt together, brushing away clumps of mud. And then, a glimmer of white cloth, a scrap of fabric, and beneath it, bone. Garrow drew in a breath. So he wasn't lying. Miss Marple's voice was very quiet. No, Inspector. But that isn't Frederick Langdon. The men looked up, startled. How can you tell? She pointed to the edge of the pit. That's a woman's shoe. Small, too small for any man. And the fabric, lace from a lady's gown. Whoever lies here was buried long before last autumn. A silence fell, heavy and cold. Garrow straightened, troubled. Then who? Miss Marple's eyes softened. Someone Reed wanted forgotten. Perhaps someone who knew too much. But Frederick, he isn't here. She turned toward the base of the tree. His inside. The hollow tree's trunk yawned open like a dark throat. Miss Marple knelt before it, brushing aside damp leaves. Her fingers touched something cold, metal. She drew it out carefully, a silver locket smeared with dirt. When she opened it, inside was a small portrait, a woman's face, smiling faintly, with the initials FL carved beneath. Frederick Langdon's locket, she murmured. But not his grave. Garrow's brow furrowed. Then where's the body? Miss Marple's gaze turned toward the stream. Where the ground gives way to the water. Reed buried him where the rain would do his work for him. They followed her down the slope, boots sinking in the mud. At the stream's edge, a section of earth had collapsed. And there, tangled in roots and reeds, was what they'd been seeking. Garrow removed his hat. God rest him. Miss Marple bent beside the body, brushing a hand gently over the tattered coat. He's at peace now. And at last, the hollow tree may sleep. Back at the cottage, Lady Blackwood sat pale and trembling by the fire. When Miss Marple entered, she rose unsteadily. "You've found him," she whispered. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "And the man who buried him." Lady Blackwood's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Jane. He was angry. I struck him with my walking stick to defend myself. Then Reed appeared. He said he'd help me. I thought it was over." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Fear can make good people do foolish things. But it's time to stop running, my dear. The truth must have its rest, just as the dead must have theirs." Lady Blackwood sank back into her chair, face buried in her hands. "Will they hang me?" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "Not for defending yourself. But you must tell everything, exactly as it happened. The lies have done enough harm." Outside, the mist began to lift. The morning light touched the wet fields, turning every drop into silver. Elmsworth, still quiet, seemed to breathe again. Children's voices echoed faintly from the green. Somewhere a bell rang for morning service. Miss Marple stood at her window, watching the clouds drift apart. Her garden was half ruined from the storm, but the roses still held their heads high. Elspeth came in carrying tea. "It's over then, Miss Marple." "Yes," she said with a gentle smile. "For now." "But how did you know it wasn't Henry who did it?" Miss Marple looked out at the mist one last time. "Because guilt speaks loudly, my dear, but innocence speaks differently. Henry's fear was real, but not the kind that comes from blood on one's hands. It was the fear of weakness, not wickedness." Elspeth nodded slowly, though she didn't quite understand. Miss Marple sipped her tea and added, "Human nature, you see, always whispers its truth, just as trees do when the wind passes through." She glanced toward the woods. The hollow tree stood far off, dark against the rising sun. Silent now, its whisper finally gone.